What's up, gangsters? How about 10 minutes or maybe 15 minutes of random? Okay, here we go. I think this random episode is going to be all about the Spitfire because that's really all I've been working on for the last week, and I thought this would be kind of might make sense to just go over some of the things that I've been doing while I get ready to start, as I'm in the run-up to starting to throw paint at this thing. As you can see, I've been doing a lot of spot priming. I'm a big believer in priming. I feel like if you don't do it, that you just must not care about getting good results, because for the life of me, I just don't see how it's possible. And specifically, spot priming is what I do before I lay down a uniform layer of primer over everything so that I can check my work any place I've been doing some. And a good example of why I do it and why I said that about not being able to achieve good results without primer is right here on top of the nose. Now, we all know that this Tamiya thing splits, like all aircraft fuselage, pretty much right down the middle, which means that there's a seam that you got to take care of. And it's a really nice joint, but you still have to do something to completely hide it. So I laid a really thin bead of sprue goo along that seam, all the way from here back to about right here. And I worked it down with a file, with sandpaper, and it looked good. I felt like I was pretty confident in it. And then I shot my first coat of spot primer on it. And I was horrified. I posted the pictures in SMCG, even though I was super embarrassed because I had file marks and sandpaper marks. I mean, it was just a yard sale right here. And you could see, and I had a ghost seam still. And it's hard to believe when you look at something like that you just didn't see any of it, especially in my case, because I do most of my work in the daytime. I've got a really nice bright 3-tube desk lamp right up there that's shining down on this thing. I've got a giant 4-foot by 4-foot window right there to my right. So I am constantly working in good light for the most part, and I do all my finishing work, pretty much all my work actually, but especially my finishing work with an optivisor on. So I am super zoomed in on that shit, and I missed all kinds of goobers they just didn't show up in the gray plastic. But when I shot that first layer of spot primer on there, it was obvious that I had my work cut out for me. So what I ended up doing was I have this old bottle of All-Clad 309 microfiller primer that totally failed me out of the airbrush. The microfiller apparently agglomerated. I mean, like, it went from good to horror show in the space of a month. And I'll never trust it again as an airbrush primer. But as a kind of a very lightweight liquid lacquer-based filler in a convenient little jar that you can use to take care of ghost seams, it's fantastic. I just brush it on. It hardens up within, no more than 15 or 20 minutes, and you can wet sand it very quickly, and it doesn't shrink, and it does a great job of taking care of those ghost seams. So I did that, did a bunch more sanding, shot some more primer. I also had discovered that I did a terrible job of redoing these two little round things here, whatever they are. So I filled them in with a little bit of sprue goo. And that was kind of a little experiment. I put the sprue goo on there in just a very, very tiny amount. This is my sprue goo. What I will do sometimes is I'll take a little bit of it out of the bottle and put it on a little aluminum dish, and I'll add some extra thin to it to make it even runnier. And I'll use just a very, very small amount to fill in something like a botched panel line or riveting job or whatever. And it was sandable within, I think I did it like 4 or 5 hours later. And then I redid those with my beating tool, and it came out much better. So that was a lot of work, but ultimately it was worthwhile. Same thing back here on the back. I had several people ask me how I handled this spine detail, because if you've built this Tamiya kit, you know that it has a double row of rivets that run right down the spine. And the bottom line is you're screwed. I applied a bead of sprue goo that probably wasn't more than 1 millimeter or 2 wide all along there. Already could see that I was filling in some of the rivets, and by the time I had dressed all that down smooth, most of those rivets were gone. So I just redid them with my Rosie the Riveter, and unfortunately all I have are the 0.65 millimeter and the 1 millimeter, and I think the only other one that they make that's in between there is 0.75. The 1 millimeter is just a skosh too far apart to match exactly the spacing on the Tamiya rivets, but they look the part. You know, with one of these little riveting tools, you do get a kind of a square hole. So what I do is I use this thing. This is a scribing tool that I got. I can't remember the name of it. It was pretty expensive, but it's pretty cool because you can get different bits for it. And in this case, this is basically like a little punch, and I will use that to basically punch the rivet to where it's rounder looking after I kind of mark it with the riveting wheel. I won't always do that, because if you got 1,000 rivets, that can get old in a hurry. But for something that's that visible and there's just not very many of them, it's not too big of a deal. So that basically is how I handled the spine rivet detail. Now, there is a little bit of rescribing, because obviously you've got some panel lines that run across the top of the spine. And my favorite tool, I wish the camera would focus on that. My favorite tool for doing that kind of a rescribe is just this. This is the Tamiya 0.5 millimeter razor saw. And it's great because you basically just get it in the groove and then just start rocking it over the top of the spine, and it does a great job. If you need to make the line a little bit wider than the tool does when it's running straight up and down, what you can do is just kind of angle it over. Run it that way a little bit, then angle it over the other way, run it a little bit, and you can gradually widen out the line like that. Okay, now you will notice that I have got the front portion of the wing here is white. That's because that's been sprayed heavily with a 2K urethane high build primer, actually the one from Gravity. And the reason that I did that is because at some point, some people say like mid-1940s, some people say not till 1942, I'm not really sure, but at some point they started issuing orders for all of this area to be filled and smoothed so that the rivet dimples were not visible. I have done that. I've smoothed it all down. I masked off all of the little inspection hatches on the bottom. I punched out little discs out of vinyl using one of my punch and die sets to do that. And so you can see kind of what I've got going on there. I smoothed them all down flush on the bottom, but on the top I let a few of them show. Just because I'm going to depict like some of these where there's a lot more foot traffic to be maybe worn and just a little bit more visible. But that's the story with all of that. To do all of that work, you used exclusively, almost exclusively, these my Infini sanding sponge sticks that I'm so fond of. I also used these new sanders from Infini. Those are really good. I like them a lot. They're a lot stiffer, but they do a great job. I just wish that they were, we're going to make them in a narrower size, because that is very often exactly what you need. Also, oh boy, we're getting up close to 10 minutes. Anyway, you will notice that with these brass cannon from Master, that I've got, that one of them is open. Now you may not know this about Spitfires, but this wing is nominally what's called the C wing, or the universal wing, which came along at about the Mark V, and it allowed them to replace the 303 machine guns with the 20mm cannon, and then put a couple of the 303s out here in these two outboard bays. But at a certain point, the Brits decided that it was smarter to get Browning M250 cals from us, because we were just churning them out by the zillions. And so they started putting those in this bay next to the 20mm cannon, and deleting the two 303s out here. And once that became the official order, which happened in my understanding by like late 1944, that's what became the E-wing for Spitfires. So if you see a Mark 9C, which is what this kit comes out of the box as, it has these just bulbous looking things on this deal right here. That's the C refers to the wing type. But if you see a Mark 9E, that means basically that the wing's been modified so that they can run the Brownings here instead of the 303s out here. And so what I'm going to end up doing is, as they did in the field, either block these off with a representation of red tape, or sometimes they put plugs in them. So we'll see how that shapes up. But I think it's going to be pretty cool. I think it'll add some visual interest to it, and give it, like I said, just a little bit more flavor. You need that with Spitfires because, I mean, let's face it, they can get kind of boring since they all look pretty much the same. All right, that's 11 minutes and 41 seconds. That's about enough of that drivel. Okay, screw it. There is one more thing I wanted to just talk about because it is just so awesome. I mentioned on the last random episode, I think, where I was talking about this, or maybe in the review that I just did of this kit, how nice that wing joint is, and you really do have to appreciate that. It is just fantastic. But here's another bit of evidence as to just how amazing the fit is. Look at the bottom there. You can see where the wing piece mates up with the fuselage piece. I mean, look at that. I've made the decision that I'm not going to do any work on that except maybe right up there by the flaps. You can see there's a little bit of a gap there. I think I'm probably just going to run some thin CA or some thin UV glue into that gap right there behind the edge of the flap. Just to make sure that takes a panel line wash the way it should. I've had to do that in a couple of other places. Where you install these gun bay covers. Sometimes you'll get even though the gap is narrow enough, it goes all the way through and it won't hold a wash, and it ends up looking inconsistent. So I did go back and fill all those in where that happened with extra thin super glue, and that's why I checked all those with spot primer just to make sure I hadn't got any stray super glue anywhere. One thing that one of my worst habits with this stuff is over gluing. I am constantly putting too much extra thin in between parts. I live in fear that this stuff is going to spontaneously fly apart, I guess. Anyway, that sometimes comes back to bite me because I'll get glue that will squish out when parts are pressed together. And that happened to me right here when I put this radiator louver in. And I just wanted to point out that this Tamiya razor saw is fantastic for restoring a joint like that. It's also really good for cleaning paint or whatever out of a panel line because it's just so easy to use, and the width is just about right. And I had some primer, like in this panel line right here. Whoops, nice little scratch there. I had primer in some places like that I had to clean out, and this thing was just wonderful for that. Okay, that's just about it. I will also point out, yes, look at how wonderful the fit of the canopy glass is. I mean, look at that. That is just phenomenal. No work required. I've got them painted on the inside. What I did with those is I just used the crappy Tamiya masks that you have to cut out yourself, and I cut them out myself, and I used them on the inside, where hopefully the fact that they aren't perfect won't show up really badly. At least not by the time I get the outside of the frames painted. The really tough one is this one right here that's got that curve in it. I don't know how you're supposed to cut that perfectly, but it's beyond the skill level of my barbaric approach anyway. But I would also like to point out that these are put on with Tamiya extra thin. I see a lot of commentary about, what do you use to glue your canopies and your windscreens and stuff like that on? And my answer is always extra thin, unless you just have a situation where the glass comes right down to the edge, and you run the risk of having that extra thin wick up into the part that you're supposed to see through. Then it's an unnecessary risk, and you might want to use something different. But for something like this, where you've got a nice wide frame especially, and it fits so well, you just put that on there and just very carefully wick some extra thin in a few spots all the way around, and you've got an outstanding a joint that is nice and strong. Again, I'm an over gluer, what can I say, but I'm just never confident in a joint that does not actually weld the plastic together. So anyway, that's my story on that, and I'm sticking to it.